Identity. Okay.
All right, so hello and welcome to How to Talk About Black Reparations with Don Tamaki. In answer to a question in the chat, yes, this event will be recorded. So if you do not wish to appear in the recording, please take this time to mute your video. Thank you. And if you have not already, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Tonight's event is led and co-sponsored by Tsuru for Solidarity, Nikkei Progressives, and Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redress. Tsuru for Solidarity is a primarily Japanese-American-led direct action project that draws on our community legacy of forced removal and mass incarceration and our address of contemporary and ongoing issues of detention and carcerality. My name is Mika, and I'm introducing us today as part of Tsuru's Redress and Reparations campaign, which connects the Japanese-American reparations movement after World War II and the generational fight for Black reparations. And one of our goals tonight is to imagine the ways in which we might move people's opinions from reparations as this tall order, this pie-in-the-sky idea, or even impossible ask, to something that is, in fact, the very least that we can do, or the least that we must do. The Nikkei Progressives and Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redress are LA-based and have a joint committee between the two organizations. NCRR is an intergenerational grassroots organization who are principal organizers in the Japanese-American redress movement. Their collaboration began in 2020-2021. Tsuru extends our thanks to them for bringing us along in this work and for being such a hugely inspiring and generative force. Tonight, we'll hear first from Don, and after Don's talk, we'll have time for audience Q&A. Then Nikkei Progressives and NCRR will make connections between their recent experiences through their pilgrimages and visits to Manzanar, Tulsa, and Jerome. Before we get started, I wanted to quickly share two community guidelines for tonight. I'll go ahead and paste these in the chat as well for anyone who would like to see them visually. Our first guideline is the one mic principle. So save your questions and responses for the Q&A or write them into the chat. And two, to take space and make space. This is a reminder to be present and to allow room for others to be present tonight as well. So now I'll turn the program over to Danielle to introduce Dawn.
Thanks, Mika. Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Iwata, she, her pronouns. I'm with Tsuru's reparations campaign, and I'm based in unceded Mossi Lenape territory, colonially known as Montclair, New Jersey. We're so excited to have Don here tonight, and I'm pleased to Don Tamaki is a senior counsel at Minami Tamaki LLP, having received his BA and JD from University of California, Berkeley. He co-founded the Asian Law Alliance in San Jose and has served as the executive director of the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. In the 1980s, he was a member of the pro bono legal team that reopened the landmark 1944 Supreme Court case of Fred Korematsu, overturning Mr. Korematsu's criminal conviction for defying the incarceration of almost 120,000 Japanese Americans. In 2012 to 13, he co-represented the California State Bar in its successful petition to the California Supreme Court to admit the first undocumented immigrant to the State Bar, Sergio Garcia. Don also co-founded Stop Repeating History to educate the public on the dangers of unchecked presidential power, drawing parallels between the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and the Trump administration's policies targeting minority groups based on race or religion. In 2021, he was appointed by California Governor Gavin Newsom to serve on the 9-member California Reparations Task Force to study the cumulative, historic, and present-day impact of 246 years of enslavement, 90 years of Jim Crow oppression, and 60 years of segregation and its vestiges, and to recommend to the legislature what California should do to address these harms. He is the recipient of the ABA Spirit of Excellence Award, the National Pacific Bar Association Trailblazer Award, and the State Bar of California Lauren Miller Award. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I'll hand it over to Don Tamaki for his presentation.
Thank you, Danielle. You didn't have to read the entire bio, but I appreciate it. And thank goodness the technology is working for me. Usually I have problems with it. And thank you for the organizers of this program, NNCR and Tsuru for Solidarity. Really appreciate this. And thank you all for joining it at really what is a dinner hour. While our online title of this presentation is Japanese American Support for Reparations and How to Talk About It. The key focus will actually be on the 5 most common arguments against reparations and the rejoinders for each. So let's get to it. What follows is illegal to teach in many states. Few things in America have become as contentious as the teaching of truth. 37 states now limit how America's history of racism can be discussed in public schools. Since 2021, states have introduced 137 bills restricting what teachers can teach about race, about history, politics, sexual orientation, and gender. Of course, you've heard of critical race theory, which recognizes that racism is more than the result of individual bias and prejudice. Unlike individual prejudice, racism is embedded in laws, policies, and institutions that uphold and reproduce racial inequalities. In response, the Florida Board of Education banned critical race theory, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the Stop Woke Act, restricting race discussions, including history, that might make students, quote, feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress because of historical racism. He declared, quote, we're not going to tell a kindergartner that they're an oppressor based on their race and what may have happened 100 or 200 years ago. So what can be taught in Florida about race? This is a famous painting by Norman Rockwell depicting Ruby Bridges in the 1960s, first day of school, being escorted by federal marshals to protect her from being attacked by an angry white mob just for daring to attend public school. Norman Rockwell didn't make this up. This happened. But because Florida law restricts the teaching of Jim Crow segregation, a cartoonist did a takeoff on the Rockwell painting depicting Ruby Bridges, but this time holding a history book, Black History, being stopped by Governor DeSantis wearing a Stop Woke armband. Well, just to be clear, today I'm not going to tell anyone that they're an oppressor. I'm not here to make anyone feel bad. I'm just here to share with you some unsugar-coated truth. Of course, no one wants to talk about slavery or putting Japanese Americans in concentration camps. But if we don't, how can we ever get better as a nation? The fact is, when it comes to race, America has been truth challenged since its inception. When I was poring over drafts of the task force's final report, I can't say I was surprised that history books used in Texas classrooms referred to enslaved people as, quote, workers, or that the Florida Board of Education's new history standard claims that, quote, slaves developed skills that could be applied for their personal benefit, unquote. Well, who knew that slavery was really a jobs program? So today I will be shining a light on truth, dissecting the ways opponents of reparations have mischaracterized truth and identifying reasonable rejoinders. As you all know, Mr. Floyd was murdered on May 25th, 2020, triggering the largest protest in U.S. history, calling for a racial reckoning. 4 months later, the state of California approved Shirley Weber's bill, AB 3121, creating the task force to study and develop reparations proposals. The purpose of the task force is to document the harm over the last 400 years, recommend ways to educate the public of our findings, and develop reparations proposals. So the 9-member task force was created, 5 members appointed by the governor, and 4 members appointed by the legislature. On June 29, 2023, after 2 years of work, 27 days of hearing, and 48 hours of testimony from expert and lay witnesses, we presented a groundbreaking 1,100-page final report to the legislature, drawing a through line from 246 years of enslavement, 90 years of Jim Crow exclusion, and decades more of continuing discrimination resulting in today's outcomes, and for which we made over 115 recommendations for repair. Fellow task force member Lisa Holder calls it the Book of Truth. Why is California leading the nation on this issue? Let me recite some history. The Civil War ended slavery in 1865, but about 5 minutes after Robert E. Lee surrendered, the South was determined to reinstate laws and ways as close to slavery as possible. And no wonder, for 246 years, the U.S. had built one of the largest and most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world. The U.S. enslaved population at that time was almost 4 million, and cotton was the economic engine for the entire country. Every sector of white society benefited from, participated in, or was complicit with slavery, including almost every major Christian denomination, colleges and universities, plantation owners in the South, and industrialists, bankers, insurance companies, and big and small businesses in the North. The nation's constitution protected slavery and gave Southern states outsized political power. Half of the nation's pre-Civil War presidents, depicted in a tint of red here, were enslavers while in office. More than 1,800 congressmen representing 37 states once enslaved Black people. At the end of the Civil War, Congress seized land from wealthy Southerners, intending to distribute 40 acres to each formerly enslaved person to establish economic means to be self-sufficient. In January of 1865, 400,000 acres from South Carolina to Florida along the coast were actually deeded to 40,000 formerly enslaved who settled on and worked the land. But by April of 1865, a mere 4 months later, Lincoln was assassinated. Vice President Johnson assumed the presidency, declaring, quote, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." Johnson rescinded the land reparations program and ordered the Black settlers to leave their land. Land reparations was scrapped to ensure peace among the states, but at an incalculable long-term cost to formerly enslaved people. During that 12-year period, post-Civil War, known as Reconstruction, Congress tried to give newly freed Black Americans access to basic civil rights, such as the right to vote. But white Northern support for Reconstruction collapsed, and to resolve the contested presidential election of 1876, Republicans and Democrats cut a deal to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. States, including California, passed literacy tests, poll taxes, and created other devices to prevent Black Americans from voting. In 1867, Black turnout was 90% in Virginia. After Virginia's voter suppression laws, Black voters dropped from 147,000 to just 21,000. These restrictions secured the power of white politicians, allowing them to block hundreds of civil rights laws, and well into the 20th century, excluding Black Americans from the country's most important rights, including such things as Social Security and labor law protections. And racial terror followed. This slide depicts the front page of the New Orleans State's newspaper, June 26, 1919, blaring the headline, 3,000 will burn Negro, with subheadline, quote, "John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 p.m. this afternoon." While lynching is often portrayed as torture murder perpetrated by a few, many were highly advertised public events attended by thousands as a means of enforcing and normalizing the social order. There were more than 6,500 lynchings nationwide between 1865 and 1955, but that is most assuredly an undercount, since many of the murders were not documented. We think of California as being an enlightened state, but while California entered the Union in 1850 as a non-slave state, it was plenty complicit with enslavers entering California and bringing their human property with them. The slide depicts 1850's announcement ad of a Negro, quote, "Negro for sale on Saturday, June 26th. I will sell at public auction a Negro man," unquote. Historians estimate that there were upwards of 2,000 enslaved people brought into California during the gold rush of 1849. In 1849, California's anti-slavery state constitution meant little because it was not a crime to keep someone enslaved. From 1852 to 1855, the legislature passed fugitive slave laws, allowing persons escaping enslavement to be chased down and sent back to the South, even though they had been living in the free state of California. This slide depicts an 1852 San Francisco Herald newspaper ad offering $100 reward for a recapture of a, quote, runaway from Mrs. Elizabeth Ware of a black girl named Hagar to be delivered in the hands of the sheriff of San Francisco. In 1850, California banned black people from testifying against whites in court, including in fugitive slave law cases. 2 years later, the California Supreme Court likewise barred Chinese testimony against white people. The result, white people could commit crimes against black and Chinese people with impunity. And much of Jim Crow found its way into California. Democrats rose to power in 1867 by vowing to fight against any new law that would make black, indigenous, or Chinese people equal to white people. At that time, there were few black people in the state, so hate groups mainly terrorized Chinese communities, and the law did not protect them, since the state Supreme Court decided that the ban on black people testifying in court applied to Chinese people too. Between 1850 and 1935, 352 lynchings took place, including of 8 black Californians, but mostly of Chinese, indigenous, and persons of Mexican descent. White supremacy groups flourished in the West. By the 1920s, California became known as a strong Klan state, with sizable chapters emerging in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Sacramento, Anaheim, and San Jose. During much of the 20th century, federal, state, and local government officials working with private individuals actively segregated America. When you align the redlining maps of the 1930s through the 1970s, this one in Oakland, California, the East Bay community, and these maps were created by lenders to exclude African Americans from being able to get federally insured loans, and you compare those with today's pre-gentrification maps of the most ultra-segregated, the most impoverished, the most underserved, the most polluted neighborhoods, they align exactly. The discrimination of the not-so-distant past, in fact, created our present. Government agencies like the Federal Housing Administration help millions of mainly white Americans buy houses, creating America's middle class, while refusing the same opportunity to black Americans. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government had issued $120 billion in home loans, 98% of which went to white people. This slide depicts Federal Housing Administration ad offering cheap federally insured home loans. The ad proclaims, quote, "With a small down payment, your rent money will be your home." It was one of a number of huge wealth transfers to mainly white Americans. California was a leader in racially exclusionary policies. By the 1940s, 80% of the homes in Los Angeles contained racially restrictive deed covenants barring black families. And when black families moved into white neighborhoods, resistance followed. This 1952 photo depicts LA neighbors William Bailey and Roger Duncan amidst the rubble of Bailey's bombed-out living room. Duncan's home was also bombed. City officials zoned African American neighborhoods as commercial or industrial, regardless of their residential character, thereby enabling polluting industries to locate there, lowering African American property values while enhancing the value of white neighborhoods. As a result, for example, in Los Angeles, African Americans are 75% more likely to live near hazardous waste. Black children are 3 times more likely to have elevated levels of lead in their blood. Black Californians are exposed to 40% more particulates from vehicles. the construction of freeways, subways, polluting industries, commercial and residential developments, and parks, all of which vastly increased productivity and wealth for entire regions, were often routed through Black neighborhoods, destroying their homes and businesses, using the legal tool called eminent domain, which allows the government to seize property by forcing its sale for a price dictated by government. This slide depicts the destruction of Black-owned homes and businesses in Oakland to make way for I-980, bisecting the city and walling off Black West Oakland. One study in 2007 found that between 1949 and 1973, there were 2,532 eminent domain projects in 992 cities, resulting in 1 million people being displaced, but 2/3 of whom were Black. In 1956, so-called urban renewal policies enabled San Francisco to condemn and tear down the Fillmore district, resulting in 20,000 African American residents being displaced and 883 African American businesses destroyed. 10 years later, the city likewise would condemn and raze Japantown, reducing it from 44 blocks to 4. The nation was enriched not only by 2.5 centuries of free labor from generational enslavement, but also by the iterations of racial exclusion that continued for more than 100 years thereafter into modern times, resulting in cumulative, compounding, and cascading consequences. So on January 31, 2024, 12 members of the legislature, comprising the California Legislative Black Caucus, introduced 14 reparative bills in education, in civil rights, criminal justice reform, healthcare, and business. This is the first step in an approach spanning years in good economies and bad to address the lingering effects of slavery. The harm was literally centuries in the making, so the repairs must be long in the implementation. But the backlash has been swift. Conservative pundits immediately condemned, ridiculed, and were dismissive of reparations. As we remember, the image of Confederate flag-toting insurrectionists smashing their way into the Capitol, longing for a racialized order, social order that should have ended with the Civil War, we realize the values of 1619 that propped up the institution of slavery and its after effects still impact the nation today. Reparations critics pander to this backlash, stoking economic anxieties, fears of unfairness, fears that money, opportunity, and rights will be taken away from one group and redistributed as a windfall to the undeserving. What are the goals of conservative thought leaders in opposing reparations? There are 3: to establish the rhetorical architecture to make the case against Black reparations, to stymie any political momentum, and to scuttle reparations proposals. Law professor Eric Yamamoto has helped to devise this training to identify the most common opposition arguments and reveal that rhetorical architecture and its flaws, provide historical context, and offer reasoned responses that are grounded in truth. The 5 most typical criticisms of reparations, often wrapped in a tone of ridicule or dismissiveness, are: 1, reparations are too late. The "it's too late" argument portrays reparations as only about slavery and therefore a bygone era and too late to do anything about. Opposition argument number 2, reparations are unwarranted. The unwarranted argument proclaims there is no reason for reparations, such as, for example, California was not a slave state, and that reparations is welfare, a handout for the undeserving. Number 3, reparations are too much. The too much argument casts reparations as only about individual compensation, and therefore unaffordable, preposterous, and fringy. The fourth argument is about other groups. What about other groups who experience discrimination? The what about, and then fill in the blank of groups who also suffered, argues that it would be unfair to single out Black people for compensation when others have suffered too. And the fifth argument is, it's not my fault, arguing that today's taxpayers were not enslavers and should not be made to pay for the harms perpetrated by long dead individuals. We will dissect the Wall Street Journal editorial opinion that just came out earlier of April 23rd, 2024, which contains in one hit piece all 5 objections. The cornerstone of the "it's too late" criticism is to say reparations is for slavery, which ended long ago, and for which it is too late to do anything about. But the rejoinder to too late is that reparations is not just about 246 years of slavery, but its badges and incidents, its lingering effects that have reverberated for 150 years thereafter, including 90 years of post-Civil War Jim Crow, segregation, and racial terror, and decades more of continuing discrimination, resulting in cascading and compounding consequences today. For example, America is as segregated today as it was in the 1940s. The exclusion from equal education, employment, the New Deal, federally insured home loans, and other opportunities have resulted in white households having 9 times more assets than Black households, Black people having an average of 7 years shorter lifespans, and for the 10-year period ending in 2021, the Black infant mortality rate in San Francisco was 5 times that of white babies, and huge disparities persisting in housing, houselessness, policing, and criminal justice, and in almost all aspects of life that matter. And governments have been adept at running out the clock, delaying legal proceedings until they became time-barred. Tulsa and the 1921 slaughter of over 300 Black residents and the burning to the ground of prosperous Greenwood, Black Wall Street section of town is certainly one example. Legal cases were delayed for decades and then finally dismissed. Turning to the reparations are unwarranted criticism. The argument declares that past injustice has nothing to do with racial disparities today. Racial discrimination has been outlawed. The playing field is level. Asian Americans and other immigrants have overcome discrimination. So if Black people can't make it in America, it's their own fault. South Carolina Senator Tim Cott has stated, quote, "I am living proof that America is the land of opportunity and not the land of oppression." But as the task force noted, past and ongoing discrimination has created today's racial disparities. Black people have been uniquely harmed by 2.5 centuries of enslavement and another century and 1/2 of subjugation and exclusion. And despite instances of individual Black success, huge group disparities persist. This slide captures some of the data that we've already covered about how enormously profitable racial exclusion has been. For most of the 20th century, racially exclusionary policies were the norm. The result has been the creation of a racial underclass, born out of segregating Black Americans into defined neighborhoods, then adopting policies ensuring those neighborhoods would be bereft of resources and opportunities, then burdening those communities by zoning them for polluting industries, freeways, and liquor stores, then declaring them blighted so that their property could be seized for development in order to create wealth for others. And contrary to the assertion that reparations are unwarranted because California was not a slave state, let it be remembered that there were about 2,000 enslaved people in California, that it passed fugitive slave laws, and like the rest of the nation, adopted the heritage of slavery, namely Jim Crow, sanctioning segregation for most of the 20th century. Turning to the criticism that reparations are too much, critics dismissively declare it's all about the money, and reparations is just a windfall check in the mail for people who were never enslaved. The legislation creating the task force required task force members to determine economic methodologies for calculating the economic harm of racial exclusion. To this end, 4 economists were retained to develop database methodologies for calculating that harm, as measured, for example, by the racially motivated property takings, by health harms as measured by an almost 8-year shorter life expectancy, or in housing discrimination. The purpose of doing such calculations was to shine a light on the enormous economic extent and impact, which had never been done before, and for which the American public should know. No doubt the process of revealing the economic costs of that harm triggers sticker shock. For example, for eminent domain takings of property, there is data available to calculate the value of the homes that were destroyed, the tiny amounts that the owners received when their property was taken, the value of the property today, and whether the owners were ever able to ever become homeowners again. If you just take one neighborhood, say the Fillmore district in San Francisco, wherein 20,000 Black residents lost their homes and businesses, it's easy to see that the losses quickly soar into the billions of dollars. So yes, the economists calculated that for just compensation, it would take billions. But we never said that the legislature should pay that amount. We never said that, for example, individual compensation is more important than reducing Black infant mortality or any other harm. So despite news media coverage reporting that the task force had recommended specific compensation of 1.2 million or billions, the task force never recommended that the state pay any specific amount. Instead, the task force has called upon the legislature to develop a feasible approach spanning years in good economies and bad, to study the 115 plus recommendations and address harm systematically that have been decades, if not centuries, in the making. Nevertheless, opponents mischaracterize the task force's work as a singular call for individual payments, fueling the clickbait sensationalism that drives news media revenues. Despite the noise, you should know that the final report contains over 115 proposals for the legislature to consider. Yes, individual compensation is among the recommendations, but the overwhelming majority of recommendations call for reforms in healthcare, in housing, in education, employment, criminal justice, and in many other areas. The final report calls upon the legislature to determine a feasible approach spanning years to address harms, I repeat, that have been centuries in the making. To those who would say that reparations is too much, it is also fair to ask, what is the cost to society, to everyone, of doing nothing? America just went through a COVID nightmare. The cost of PPP equipment, hospitalizations, the cost of developing and deploying vaccines was enormous. But what would have been the cost and lives lost in a destroyed economy to society as we know it if those costs were not incurred? Yes, the cost to repair the harms of slavery and its lingering effects in various forms, from exclusion and discrimination, reverberating over centuries. That cost is expensive, but the societal cost of ignoring these issues is astronomical, whether measured in the cost of healthcare and shortened lives, houselessness, public safety, loss of productivity, intractable poverty, mass incarceration. Recall a 1970s bumper sticker that teachers used to put on their cars, which read, quote, "If you think education is expensive, try ignorance," unquote. Indeed. Turning to the criticism, it's not my fault. I was not an enslaver. Why should I pay? The answer to "it's not my fault" narrative is that state-sanctioned harms require state-sanctioned repairs. Reparations is the acknowledgement of societal debts arising from stolen lives, wages, property, and opportunities. Just as in any other societal debt, from wars, climate change created by the burning of fossil fuels, public works projects, natural disasters, human-caused wrongs, the societal debt of reparations is a collective responsibility. I'm not an executive in big oil that is driving global climate change, which has and will cause enormous harm, but I'm pretty sure my tax dollars will be paying for it. We pay for societal debts that the nation incurs now, or years, decades, or even more than a century ago. For example, a 2013 analysis of federal records revealed that the government is still making payments monthly to relatives of Civil War veterans. As we pay for societal debts, whether or not we personally did anything to cause those debts to be incurred. For example, over a 20-year period, Brown University estimated that the war in Afghanistan cost more than $2 trillion. That is over $3 million a day for 20 years. Opponents argue that it is unfair to single out Black people for repair when others have suffered discrimination. This is the "what about" argument. But the "what about" argument essentially states that if we can't solve for all harmed people at the same time, all at once, we shouldn't solve for anyone. We don't apply this precondition to other forms of repair. States that suffer devastating wildfires don't say, quote, "until we are fully restored, there should be no funds for states experiencing devastating hurricanes." With respect to reparations provided before to Japanese Americans, to descendants of the Rosewood Massacre, to 9/11 victims, to the small amounts that were provided to Native Americans, government did not interpose a condition that no reparations would be provided unless it was at the same time provided to all groups. The Wall Street Journal's opinion illustrates the 5 opposition narratives. I'll quickly read the gist. Bad ideas never die. They go to California, and the latest is reparations for slavery. The Judiciary Committee voted to create the Freedmen Affairs Agency to implement recommendations from the state task force. It would establish an office to determine who would be eligible for a reparations windfall. The same committee cleared 2 other reparations bills, part of a package of 14. One bill would compensate African Americans for land taken for racially motivated reasons. The other would set aside 6% of state budget reserves to fund reparations. This comes on the heels of the task force report calling for a payment of $1.2 million for each adult. Estimates reckon the cost to taxpayers would be $800 billion. California's entire annual budget is $300 billion. Last year, San Francisco's Reparations Committee submitted a plan to pay $5 million each. There are problems of fairness. The court has barred programs that allocate benefits by race. But why should a Chinese American whose great-great-grandparents were discriminated by the Chinese Exclusion Acts have to pay for what slavery did to Black Americans? What about descendants of those who gave their lives in the Civil War to end the slave system? California wasn't even a slave state. Some say reparations won't pass. Last year, Governor Newsom said he regarded reparations as, quote, much more than cash payments. However, in California, ideas once thought impossible have a way of becoming inevitable. Think free health insurance for millions of illegal migrants. Once the genealogy office identifies beneficiaries, they will become a political constituency that will lobby for this vast wealth redistribution. Californians oppose reparations by more than 2-1, and not because they are indifferent to the stain of slavery. Taking cash from one group of Americans who had nothing to do with slavery and giving it to the descendants of those who suffered from it would add one injustice to another. So let's go back to the editorial and dissect its messaging. Highlighted are key passages in yellow that contain the messaging. Look at the rhetorical framework here. The first sentence begins with a ridicule. Bad ideas never die, which serves as the springboard for the central premise of this opinion, defining reparations as being exclusively about slavery. In other words, the "it's too late" narrative. And right out of the gate, this is followed by defining reparations as, quote, a windfall for the undeserving. This is the "it's unwarranted" argument. By omitting the nation's history of land confiscation and eminent domain takings, by omitting any mention of the enormous profits that have been reaped by state-sanctioned exploitation and exclusion of Black people, the Wall Street Journal paints a picture that compensation for land seizures is unwarranted and that budget set-asides to fund reparations are too much. Having defined reparations as being exclusively about slavery and therefore unwarranted, the opinion portrays reparations as only individual compensation and therefore too much. The opinion says that the task force, quote, called for the state to pay $1.2 million each. We never made such a recommendation. But putting aside this false statement, look what is really going on here. By coupling the "it's unwarranted" narrative that reparations is welfare for the undeserving, and you couple that with the figure of $800 billion, it becomes a powerful emotional trigger. The "it's unwarranted" and the "it's too much" narrative are followed by the "what about" argument. The portion opens with questions about fairness and then deploys the AAPI model minority myth to bolster the argument that Black reparations are unwarranted. The opinion asks, why should a Chinese American whose great-great-grandparents were discriminated against have to pay for what slavery did to Black Americans? Remarkably, in a single sentence, the opinion pits Asian Americans against Black people and amalgamates the "it's not my fault" claim with the "what about" narrative that Black people should not be given reparations when Chinese Americans have suffered too. And for good measure, the opinion throws in, and California wasn't even a slave state, a species of the "it's unwarranted" argument. Parenthetically, the "what about" argument that white people gave their lives during the Civil War so that Black Americans could be free. Never mind that Black people have fought in every war, including the Civil War, and gave their lives for America since the founding of this nation. Note the trigger words that the opinion mobilizes in defining reparations. Think health insurance for millions of illegal migrants, conflating the nation's border issues with Americans who have been lawfully here for centuries. Furthermore, this passage defines reparations as a, quote, vast wealth redistribution and not repairs for state-sanctioned harms and repayment of a debt owed. Speaking of what about the vast wealth redistribution of the Homestead Act of 1862 that gave nearly 4 million white Americans across 30 states vast amounts of federal land? What about the fact that between 1934 and 1962, the federal government had issued 120 billion in cheap home loans, 98% of which went to white people? The opinion circles back to where it began, closing with the "it's not my fault" and "why should Americans having nothing to do with slavery, have to pay for those who did not suffer from it?" And combining the "it's too late" narrative, reparations is all about slavery, with the "it's unwarranted" narrative, reparations is a handout for the undeserving. Let me back up. So I hope this session has given you the tools to, one, identify the arguments against reparations, two, understand what is really going on, and three, armed with the truth, the facts, constituting the rejoinder to each argument, enabling you to actually make the case, the opposition counter narrative. If you only remember one slide from this presentation, let it be this one. The history of racial exclusion is depicted as an arc of 4 centuries, graphically showing that Black Americans as a people have been longer enslaved than they have been free. Even this image is misleading in that it suggests that in 1954, when the Supreme Court outlawed segregated schools in Brown versus Board of Education, it ended segregation. Far from it. Fierce resistance to the struggle for equal rights occurred all over the nation and is still continuing. So at this point, I think we can open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Hold on a second here. There we go. Well, everyone, that was very, very informative. Thank you, Don. Thank you so much for that. So now we are going to open up this portion of the program to Q&As. If anyone has, I'm going to open up with a few questions that have already been submitted here. So, Don, what lessons did you take away from being a part of the California Reparations Task Force?
I learned I had to earn my way on it. I was the only member of the task force, as you saw from that picture, who was not Black. And I was obviously the sore thumb that stuck out. And the running joke was I was the little old Asian man that photobombed the group task force picture. The other lesson I learned was I thought I knew something about American history. Turns out I knew very little. And that was not only true for me, that was true for every member of the task force who are reparation scholars. They've studied this stuff. But the fact of the matter is the history is so erased, it's so buried. And the final report, there were numbers of university professors, 30 lawyers, PhDs that put this together and researched it. they brought to bear the research that was done in the last 5 years. So a lot of the things that were revealed in the report are new. And for most of the public, the Wall Street Journal, for example, ran an article some time ago on Tulsa and the burning down in Greenwood. And that happened more than 100 years ago. People are learning about it for the first time, And so this is an issue of the truth being suppressed, basically. And that's why I began the slideshow as I did, that this is about unpacking and revealing truth, which is essential to be able to respond to the arguments against reparations.
Well, I have to tell you, I really appreciated that presentation because I learned a lot as well. I'm an extension of my parents, they were part of the civil rights movement. So I appreciate what you put into this presentation. Next question. What specific lessons can be learned from the legal fight and community organizing from JA Redress and RIPS?
That the process is lengthy. People think, I think we need to realize, not to remind myself, the Japanese American Redress and Reparations was a 20-year movement. And the scale of it is not comparable. I mean, 4 years, there's no equivalence between 4 years in a concentration camp and 400 years of enslavement and then systematic exclusion at every turn, thereafter. But I think one of the major things we learned is that we have to move the needle of public opinion. And Black people in California, for example, just one state, are only 6% of the population, nationwide 14%. So this movement is going to depend upon, it has to be Black-led, make no mistake about it, but it has to be joined in by other groups, other Americans who just understand that this is a justice issue. And I think that's what happened with the Japanese American reparations effort. It became a question of simple justice. And I think that is the pivot that has to be made. Now it's being characterized as a handout to the undeserving, a welfare check. And I think it's up to us to redefine this as a matter of long overdue justice. And I know everybody on this webinar understands that. But that was I think, fundamental lesson of Japanese American Redress and Reparations. Maybe one other thing, to be honest with you, when me, Iwataki, and some of the other folks on this conference talked about reparations for Japanese Americans in 1971, 72, 73, I said, no way is this ever going to happen. And it did. And so the message is keep the faith.
Okay, hold on. But I lost my little thing here. Hold on a second. Sorry. Okay, so how can everyday folks support the movement to work for reparations? Or how can JAs, other communities show up as good allies to this movement?
I asked that question when I joined the task force. What is my role as the only non-Black person on this task force? And then with the help of my fellow task force members, they said, we need you, we need allies to push this out to others. So the first thing we do is what we're doing here is to educate ourselves. The next step is to take what you learn and then push this out. This PowerPoint and the script that goes along with it, you guys are all test guinea pigs. This is a test run, folks. And if you think it was a worthy presentation, I want to make the PowerPoint and the script available to the groups on this call, but others, to modify it and tailor it to the audiences, to families, friends, audiences you deal with, and do your own presentations. when you see these five opposition arguments to reparations, you've all seen them in one form or another. You know, we see them all the time. This is all about money. This is about slavery. This is something that happened, you know, so long ago. Why bring it up? And so I think in moving the needle of public opinion, as we had to do in the Japanese American redress and reparations movement, you have to unpack what the answers are. And so it requires us to be conversant, to be educated about it. And it took me a long time to put together the presentation because there's so much noise going on. It's difficult to sort it out, parse out the rhetorical argument, the architecture of it, we call it, and to figure out what is really being said here, and then pinpoint the soundbite answer. And I think when you boil it all down and you distill it, the rejoinders are pretty simple. And so I would call upon, if you think this is worthy, everybody on this conference, to begin to get comfortable with what those, you know, what the counter narrative is. And that, I think that's a first step in moving the needle, you know, public opinion. I will say that I'm part of an organization called the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation and Truth, ARRT, and it's co-led by the California Black Power Network, a coalition of about 40 Black-led community organizations in California up and down the state, and Equal Justice Society, which is led by Lisa Holder, who was on the task force. And there are 4 other Black organizations, including Live Free, Black Equity Collective, policy group called the California Catalyst, and did I mention Black Equity Collective? One other. It'll come back to me. And then there's about another tier, about 20 multiracial organizations comprising a multiracial steering committee that is just ramping up. So I expect in the next 2 weeks, the press releases to come out, the social media pieces to come out, the website to be launched. And it's a way for groups like you all to be able to plug in. And of course, it'll contain toolkits and resources. But it basically will map out the direction of reaching out. And the effort is twofold. One is the policy side, and there are about 20 bills in California, in one state, which deal with the beginnings of effectuating the 115, beginning to effectuate the 115 proposals for repair. And so ART is sort of reacting to the bills that are out there and pushing the ones that we strongly agree with along, but also studying the 115 recommendations for repair with a proactive agenda among all 115, which are the ones we really believe are important. And percolating right up to the surface, of course, are housing, healthcare, policing, and other areas. The other half of that is moving the needle of public opinion, which is the organizing part. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is that we reach out to the non-Black populations in not only my state, but across the country. Now, New York has adopted the same legislation, reparations creation, a bill creating a task force to study and develop proposals. Illinois has done one. And there may be 20 or 30 across the country in counties and cities that are also dealing with this, whether it's Evanston or Providence or Rhode Island, Asheville, North Carolina, or in some of the others. So to the extent that we can amplify those efforts, we need you to do that. So those of you who are located in states outside California, ART is very interested in linking up to push this out into other states. Finally, I will say that the final report, if you haven't seen it, you can Google California Reparations Task Force. And the 1,100-page report, I mean, the strength of it is so authoritative and so well footnoted and written so well. But the weakness is it's 1,100 pages. So to the extent that groups like you can begin to reduce it into bite-sized, manageable, accessible bits, could be in, 15-second TikToks, or it could be in smaller documentaries, or it could be in dramatic works. There's plenty of material in the final report that are stories of what people went through that should be told. So any way we can amplify that and get it out, there it is. I think that California's final report is really, I mean, if HR 40 ever passed, which it has no chance of doing now, frankly, to be honest, and the commission bill was passed to produce a study, this is it. I mean, each chapter, it has 13 chapters on just the history, begins with enslavement, goes into racial terror. The next chapter is political disenfranchisement. Then it goes into segregation, because once you can segregate housing, everything else follows, whether it's healthcare, employment, everything else. Then it goes into culture, entertainment, leisure, the arts, healthcare. And it starts with what happened in America, what happened nationwide. And then it ends with what happened in California. Every state, in fact, every city has its own horrific story to tell. And so it can augment, and instead of saying what California did at the end, it can say what happened in New York City. What happened in Dallas, Texas. What happened in any of the other states, or any of the other cities for that matter. So the material is now out there. So we need creative people with a lot of energy to take that and make a project out. And we'd be happy to work with you. Art has 6 of the 9 task force members that have joined it, along with, these legions of other organizations. We've also pushed out, for which you all are, the groups are signatories, organizations that have endorsed reparations and endorsed the report. So it's 620 organizations, including SUDU and NNRC, I'm sure is on there. 75 of those organizations are Asian American groups, I'm proud to say. 50 are Japanese American organizations. I can't tell you how happy and heartening that is for Black organizations leaders to see that. They've come up to me. A lot just assumed that we wouldn't be in this fight. And so the fact that we show up big, as you all who've been interacting with groups, the leaders of this organization, know full well. So that list of 600 endorsing organizations should be 1,000, should be thousands. So if you can help us push that out, I'd be so grateful. And we don't have a endorsement list for individuals, or all organizations now. And they're, most are in California, but they're all over the country too.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We have time for one more question. And this one is, what has been the response from grassroots members of the Black community to the 115 proposals in California? And how are they being engaged to take leadership of the next steps as well?
Yeah, I think this thing is just barely beginning to enter the public consciousness. I mean, the good news is that people are talking about reparations like never before in my lifetime. Never before. I mean, 5 years ago even, this would have been regarded as just preposterous. But now there's discussion, there's documentaries that are going out, sponsored by mainstream news media sources. And so it's getting out there. But in the Black community, like our community as well, Japanese American community, there are many people who are not aware of it still. There are many people who say it'll never happen. There are some who are highly active and organized with it. But in every sector, a lot of work needs to be done. So within our coalition, the Black organizations are focusing in on messaging uh, the Black community. I think for the other groups, we have to focus on the networks that we have. And of course, Japanese American, Asian American. But um, there are professional societies. For instance, one of the endorsing organizations is the Bar Association of Los Angeles. That's one of the biggest organizations of lawyers in the entire country. There are labor unions, teachers, faith community, big and small community organizations. We should be figuring out a way to penetrate each of those. So, but to answer the question honestly, it's just starting. The signs are good. It's too early to tell how far and how successful this is going to be. But the start of it is very, very promising. And so, but we need you all to get involved in it at one level or another in your own networks.
All right.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much. Thank you so much, Dawn. Thank you so much, Sharon, for facilitating our Q&A, and to our audience members for such fantastic questions, and also for the resources that everyone is dropping in the chat. If you haven't flipped over to that window, make sure you check those out. Now we're going to hear from Nikkei Progressives and NCRR in some reflections from events earlier this year.
Thank you, Mika. Thanks so much, Dawn. That was incredible. We're continuing to learn how we want to, deepen and expand our conversations with different people who are either on the fence or, far from the fence in terms of their engagement and understanding around reparations. So, yeah, super inspired. My name is Tracy Kato Kiriyama. You can call me TKK. My pronouns are they plus she. I'm based on unceded Tongva land in the South Bay of Los Angeles. I'm with Nikkei Progressives and NCRR. We have a reparations committee that is been studying and building relationships with folks. We started mostly concentrating on the HR 40 coalition, which became the Why We Can't Wait coalition. But, we've been really excited to build more with folks in California as well. So we just wanted to give a couple updates. We've been on a lot of pilgrimages and visits. And so we want to talk briefly about Manzanar, Tulsa, and Jerome. So I think we have about 12 minutes, 12-ish, maybe 15 minutes. I don't know, 12 to 15 minutes. And so myself, Mia Iwataki, and Kathy Masaoka, we're just going to give some reflections. But I will say right now that we are going to have much deeper conversation at our monthly meeting, which is this Thursday. I know that there are quite a few folks on this call who come to those calls. We are going to have more of a report back on Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific time. So please reach out to Mia, Kathy, myself, and I know others are here too. I think Miyako is here too. So you can reach out to any of us if you'd like to join us for that. But with Manzanar, we were really excited to convene 2 buses that we took on a pilgrimage to Manzanar, which was at the end of April. And we invited folks from the reparations movement. So we had people who flew in from different parts of the country, people that we've been building with since about 2021 as we formed our actual reparations committee together. And so we had people from representing about 22 plus organizations. And that included Kenneth Henry from NCOBRA. It included members of the California Black Power Network. We had representatives of other areas of engagement and work from Nikkei Progressives. We had a strong contingent of people who work in our immigration area. And I think Kimi and June are on this call. You can ask them more about it. But we had folks from the Inland Coalition of Immigrant Justice. For Immigrant Justice, we had folks from API Rise. We had a couple representatives from the Palestinian Feminist Collective and one of our friends from the Palestinian Youth Movement, as well as just a host of other folks. And then, of course, Dawn and Cheryl Girls from the California Reparations Task Force itself, they came on our buses as well. So we had a lot of folks who were going together, and many who were going for the first time to an American concentration camp. It was a really powerful day. We ended by meeting with local folks from the Paiute community in Big Pine around the Three Creeks land back that's happening up there. And it really, you know, one of the questions that we asked ourselves when we were getting onto those buses, we just asked ourselves to think about who we were taking onto the buses with us. And on the bus that I was on, it was really amazing to listen to Kevin Cosney from the California Black Power Network speak about how he thought about his ancestors in Ghana and sort of like what that meant for him to go onto this bus, thinking about what that meant for his ancestors to board ships. And, you know, we just had so much, I think, growth in our relationship building across many communities during that trip. And we were, you know, exhausted and tired together, and we were inspired together. So, you know, we're continuing to do follow-up from that trip, and we hope to have some sort of pilgrimage like that next year. So please stay up with us on that. I don't know if we'll be able to handle 2 buses. Maybe we'll hone in on 1 bus, but it was a powerful group of nearly 80 people on that trip. Then about a month later, we had a contingent go to Tulsa. And in the chat, I linked above, there's a YouTube link up there, and I can paste it again. So that is to a film called Greenwood is Still Burning. We took a contingent, again, it was a national contingent. We had members of NNRC. We had folks, Emily was able to make it out, Lisa Doy from Chicago. We had Corey Ohama from San Francisco. We had several of us from Los Angeles. Josefina came out from Seattle. Yuriko came out from New York. We had many folks joining in as this sort of like first contingent that we wanted to organize to be a part of and witness and really learn a lot from the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot commemorations. So if you have not yet been able to study about the Tulsa Massacre, which Dreesen Heath will also just say, you know, point out that it was a genocide. And we learned so much by being there. We had read about it, right? Watched some documentaries, but actually being there in Tulsa and meeting with people from Justice for Greenwood, meeting folks from the Terrence Crutcher Foundation, people who are descendants of the movement for justice and reparations for survivors and descendants of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Again, like there's nothing there's nothing like being in person and going together and really meeting with people who are actually working directly on these issues and who have been holding these stories for generations. It was really, really powerful. We were invited because of Dreesen Heath to actually speak on a panel together on the second day that we were there. Oh my gosh, the film. Let me say the film first. So the link is to Greenwood is Still Burning. That was the first thing that we did when we flew in to Tulsa. We were able to see the premiere of this film. It's an amazing 30-minute documentary. I really encourage you to watch it. I really understood more what is said about Tulsa being kind of ground zero for reparations. It is the most well-documented massacre in the country. And they have been dismissed. Their case, their lawsuit on behalf of the survivors has continually been dismissed, continually been ignored. And so there is a sense among activists that if it does not happen in Tulsa, it's not going to happen anywhere. Once you see this film, I feel like you'll be compelled into it as much as we were. But yes, we went on to be able to do a panel anyone from our contingent who wanted to speak, we all, I think 9 of us got up there and we represented and presented together. We really focused on Japanese American organizing or organizers and sort of like what compels us to be very, very active in the reparations movement. So yeah, it was really an incredible experience. The next morning, I'm saying these things also because I do hope that you'll join us in Tulsa next year and do these things as well and go on the tour with Chief Amusan. And he gives these tours regularly. And it was really an incredible political, personal tour. He is a descendant of survivors. He's a descendant of folks who were in survivors of the massacre, including his own father. And so, I'm sorry, his grandfather. Yeah. So, it was really something else to be with him and see that you'll hear folks talk about it as Black Wall Street, and he'll talk about how he doesn't say Black Wall Street. He talks about Greenwood because it wasn't just one street. It was a massive area of about 35 blocks. And so he really drove us around and we really saw the impact of that. But to say more, I want to pass it off at this point to Mia. Mia was able to fly in by the time we got to do the tour with Chief Amusan. And yeah, Mia, if you could say more about that as you lead into talking about Jerome.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. I mean, Tracy's so articulate. I'm going to just kind of speak emotionally here. Chief Amusan, the passion and the memory, and it was raining, so we couldn't go outside. We were just stuck in the van, but that meant he had to talk story more. And, it's like when we go on a pilgrimage, it's different being there where the barracks were, where our ancestors were, than seeing it on Zoom. And just as he drove us through Greenwood, it was like being there. We heard stories of resistance when the white, and he makes sure that we know it's not a mob, it was a militia. It was sent in by the city of Tulsa. It was not just a random mob. This was planned out. When the militia came in, firebombed homes and shot people as they were running out. One hero named Peg Leg Johnson, was that his name? He was a World War I vet. He had a piece of artillery. He went to a top of the hill and held the people off, held the militia off to allow folks whose homes were being firebombed to run out in the streets. And that's why they brought in the planes to air bomb and totally devastate Greenwood. It just, we saw stairs, just stairs on a hillside going up to nowhere, and they were called the steps to nowhere because they kept them there because those were the homes of that were firebombed and destroyed. And it was just so visceral to be a part of that. And visiting the Greenwood Cultural Center, where we saw portraits of survivors and descendants and excerpts from testimonies they gave. And that drew me back to our own Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians hearings, because we heard the same things in their stories. Don, we talk about connecting the dots, and this was really connecting the dots. People talked about how they never knew about this, or their parents didn't want to talk about it because of the shame, the anger, the pain, similar things that we went through. Chief Amusan showed us these old brick buildings that were sites of a concentration camp that the people of Tulsa were put into. And I never knew about this until Dreesen Heath had told me before, but he showed us the actual places where people were incarcerated, where they were forced to incinerate bodies of their own neighbors who were killed and, into ashes and bury them to try to hide the evidence. There were just, it was horrible. And yet, we see people resisting. I came in late, but my Tracy and Kathy and them, they were able to see Mother Randall, who just turned 110. She's one of the 2 survivors that is fighting for reparations. And, we all, want to do whatever we can to support it. And so Kathy, Emily, Dreesen, and myself drove from Tulsa to Rower and Jerome, Arkansas to be a part of that pilgrimage, where we presented a workshop entitled Tulsa to Jerome Rower, Why Japanese Americans Support Reparations. And this was not just, plain old panel workshop. Kathy will talk more about it, but it was just, the title was exactly, why we were there, what was in our hearts. And I know I'm going all over the place because I'm just still so moved by it, but it turned out that, with having Dreesen with us was such, was so positive. And in fact, I think, unfortunately for her, probably over half, she spoke probably for more than half of the workshop. But I truly believe that showing excerpts from our commission hearings and showing an excerpt from, what was the film, Greenwood Rising? Really connected the dots for the folks that were in our workshop. We were afraid we'd only have 15, 20 people. There were about 67 people. And after Dreesen spoke, they got it. We had one Nisei man, he really was, into it. He was from Sacramento, talking about, how they were trying to get reparations for federal workers that were in camp. And, he was really, really going on. And then all of a sudden at the end, he said, without the civil rights movement and the Black movement, Japanese Americans would not have won redress. And the types of comments from the workshop showed that people really got it, that the support was there. Not everybody, but it was a very positive experience. And it just, connected the dots between what was happening in Tulsa and how our own struggle with camps and honoring our legacy and our history just became so real. It was really a good trip, aside from getting to know people like, Regina Boone joined us in Rower Jerome, and it was really a good and a strong team. And I'll turn it over to Kathy to talk a little bit more about the workshop.
I'm just going to add a couple of things because I know that we're at time, actually. So, Regina Boone and Kemi Uchiyama were part of the panel, along with Emily Akpan and as Mia said, and several of the older survivors actually of Roar spoke, and they all spoke to the fact that, if it wasn't for the Black community and their fight for civil rights, we would not have fought for redress. We would not have gotten redress. And then it continued with, if we hadn't gotten redress, we probably wouldn't be going to these pilgrimages, so it was kind of this continuous line of like how all of this led to our being stronger as a community. And that's why we're here today in terms of speaking up for Black reparations. It's a continuity of things. And I just want to say that one person though, and I think because there were 67 people in the workshop, we passed out cards so that people could write down their questions, because we really wanted to know what people thought. But we got about 15 cards back. A lot of them were on eligibility. And I think, speaking to Dawn's presentation, later on, one person came up to me and I didn't know what she was talking about when she said, "It's too much." And I said, "Wait, what's too much?" And it was just out of the blue. And she said, "It's too much." And I said, "Oh, she means reparations. What they're asking for is too much." And I thought, wow, okay. She didn't ask it in the workshop and she didn't write it on a card, but she asked it afterwards. And I thought, yeah, that's probably on some people's minds. And I think because Dawn presented the history first, and I think in our case, we presented the reparations demands first. Maybe it made a difference, but I think that understanding of why it is owed. And I was going to actually say, it's not enough, actually. It's not too much, it's not enough. But at any rate, the point is that we learn from these workshops. And, it's really important, I think, to find out what people really are thinking, to make it so that they say their questions. Because if we don't really know, we're not really getting anywhere. So that's important. And I just want to point out one other, we heard in Tulsa, the author of this book, Marcus Anthony Hunter, we were really fortunate to hear him first before we spoke. And I would recommend this book. It's called Radical Reparations, Marcus Anthony Hunter. And he says, you know, the word reparations doesn't have an I in it, like the word repair. Reparations is a collective thing. It's about a group. It's about healing and fighting for reparations as a collective, not one person. You know what I mean? So he said a lot of good things. But I do also want to acknowledge Yoshiko Yeto, who's on this call, because if it weren't for Yoshiko, a lot of things wouldn't have happened, from Tulsa to Aurora to Manzanar. So we created these wonderful cards with a QR code with all the resources. And just acknowledging all the people that are on this call that were at the Aurora pilgrimage. So yeah, I think that's it. That's enough.
Can I just say one more thing I forgot to mention? The Justice for Greenwood call that Lush Cosmetics is making. So for those of you who would like an excuse to go shopping, and Jan Tokumaru and I loved it. The thing that Demario Solomon Simmons, who is the lead attorney on the lawsuit against the city of Tulsa, that is awaiting its results from the state of Oklahoma Supreme Court, you know, he made it a big point at the end of the film, Greenwood is Still Burning. At the end of the premiere, he was talking about how much, you know, obviously partnership and collaboration and accompliceship is so important, right? And so Lush Cosmetics was the producer of that film, and they took their partnership pretty deeply and expansively, and they educated 2,100 employees in all of their 200 plus stores across North America to basically have a main, basically center of room display with a QR code to the film, a soap that has 100% proceeds. This is the soap. 100% proceeds goes back to Justice for Greenwood. And they also have these cards. Down here in the South Bay, we were able to get them to extend it for 2 more weeks. But if you can go, maybe if you're near a Lush, go and ask them about this campaign. They are basically trying to appeal to the U.S. Attorney General Garland to demand a federal investigation into the conduct in 1921 and the massacre. So, you know, we've also realized that just because Lush is ending their campaign, it doesn't mean that we have to. So we already talked to a store manager who wants to help extend the campaign. And we're going to obviously reach out to the Justice for Greenwood folks and have conversation about how we can include this in some of our letter writing and postcard efforts that we're doing through Nikkei Progressives and NCRR. So please, you know, please be in touch with us, but you can also go and fill out cards and get people to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all the great information and sharing your experiences. My name is Miwa Tokunaga Griffin, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm in the reparation group for Truth for Solidarity. And I would like to share information about upcoming events and also other useful information which are related to the reparations. But before sharing the information, I know the time is a little bit limited, but I would like to extend our sincerest gratitude to Mr. Tamaki for sharing your wisdom and insight and experiences with us today. The presentation not only gave us new information, but also tools for us to take action in our day-to-day. So thank you very much, Mr. Tamaki. And also, we also want to express our heartfelt appreciation to each and every one of you. Your presence here today has added immense value to our gathering. We hope this will not be the last time we will share the same space, and we are looking forward to collaborating and working together to make the reparation happen nationwide. Also, to Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redness, and also Nikkei Progressive, thank you so much for collaborating with us and working with us today. We can't wait to strengthen our relationship and moving the needle together. So today we learned useful information and tips. But when I say this quote, I remember my teachers from back in school, but knowing is not the same as doing. So as the Truth for Solidarity Reparation Group, we are planning to have an event where you can get together with community members and also like discuss what we learned today and get ready to talk about reparation with others. So it will be held on Tuesday, July 23rd from 5 p.m. And we hope you can join us for the event as well. If you like to join and for the event, I'm sharing the yeah, that's the link you can join from. And also regarding local reparation fights, our group just returned from a trip to Tulsa, like other people talk about, Oklahoma, to connect with groups such as Justice for Greenwood, fighting for reparations for the survivors and the descendants of the Greenwood massacre. As they continue their legal battle, you can support by sending an email to Attorney General Garland demanding a thorough investigation into massacre from, I think people are sharing, just in case I'm going to share from here. And right now, as of right now, we have 118 people right here. So if we can send an email, that can be adding the pressure. So yeah. Before we are closing, I want to check in with the other organizer. Is there any information we need to share? I'll wait for a little bit.
Sorry, I'll share. So I think we shared about the National Nikkei Reparations Coalition, which is a coalition of dozens of Japanese American organizations that are supporting Black reparations. We really want to continue to activate the group and also think about how we can be forming our own actions over the coming months that are aligned with the Why We Can't Wait coalition, but, is also using our own agency to organize that doesn't just rely on specific, the labor of specific folks like Dries and Heath, who we mentioned, who has been with us. So we really want to do that. We are thinking also about what it looks like to organize within our community, but also what it looks like to strengthen the multiracial movement for Black reparations. So we want to be thinking about that, strategizing more, thinking about the next steps, and continuing to do this work. So the National Nikkei Reparations Coalition, if you are part of an organization or even as an individual and you want to be a part of that work, we can send out more information in the follow-up email. And we can share information also about NP/NCRR and also Sudo for Solidarity's campaign and committees so that people can find places to plug in and do this work together.
If you're interested in joining our group, please feel free to email me. I'm the person who sent out all the reminder emails that you all got in your inbox. So please, if you want to join our biweekly Sudo reparations meetings, feel free to send me an email directly. And I also want to plug that Sudo for Solidarity is having our annual virtual fundraiser. That's this Saturday. Our very lovely Lisa Doi put the registration link in the chat. It's a night of performances, and you don't have to give a donation to register. It starts at free, and then you can donate if you are able to. It should be a really fun night as well. And I see Kathy also wanting to jump in.
Well, I just want to also emphasize that Don mentioned the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth. And I think it's important for us to also participate in organizations that are not only JA or API, but, some of us also participate with Nikichi Taifa's group. She does a roundup, a reparations monthly meetup, and anybody is welcome there. It's just information sharing and getting familiar with the faces of people that are involved nationwide in all kinds of organizations around reparations. And so I think it's good for us to hear and see, and people to see us in these spaces. So I just want to encourage people to do that. We try to include that in our information that we send out. We could probably add that to information that was sent out after this too, if possible. Thanks.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much for one more time to everyone for taking time, and I hope we will be able to keep working together and make reparation happen nationwide. Thank you very much.